There's a moment in Season 1, Episode 6, the CDC episode, that most people remember for the explosion, the countdown, the panic, the firelit farewell before everything went white. But there's something quieter that happens just before all of that, and I keep coming back to it. Dr. Edwin Jenner leans toward Rick Grimes, just a whisper, and says something the camera won't let us hear. Not yet. What it stays on instead is Rick's face, and what I notice every time I watch it is that Rick doesn't look surprised. He looks like someone who has just been told something he already half knew. Behind them, the vault door seals shut. One last closed door in a building full of them. What did Jenner know? And more importantly, what did the world already know, long before anyone was willing to say it out loud? Let's sit quietly with this one. The world Rick Grimes woke into was already 3 weeks gone. That's something the show tells you quietly, almost offhandedly. He's been in that hospital coma since the earliest chaos, and when he opens his eyes in Season 1, Episode 1, the halls are dark, the bodies decomposing in the corridors, the doors already barricaded. Someone had already tried to hold something back. Someone had already failed. Rick didn't miss the beginning of the end. He missed the middle of it. And here's what I keep thinking about when I sit with that detail. The show never explains how it happened. Not really. Not in any satisfying scientific or conspiratorial way. We get glimpses, a radio broadcast trailing off, a newspaper left on a gas station counter. The haunted look of people who saw something before Rick woke up, but never a clean answer. The Walking Dead, across 15 seasons and 4 spin-offs, chose never to explain the origin of the outbreak. That silence is deliberate, and I think it might be telling us something. Think about what we actually see when Rick walks out of that hospital. There's Morgan Jones, sheltering with his son Dwayne in a suburban house, already expert at boarding windows and reading walker movements. Morgan has clearly been doing this for weeks. He has a system. He has a grief. His wife turned and he can't bring himself to end it. That has already settled into something livable. Loss had already reorganised itself into routine. The world had already remade itself around survival before Rick even got to hold a gun. This is worth pausing on, because the show presents Rick as our entry point, our guide, our lens on a world we're discovering alongside him. But what if that framing's part of the theory itself? What if Rick's ignorance, and by extension our ignorance, is the point? He doesn't know what caused this. He doesn't know the timeline. He doesn't know what the military did or didn't do, what the government tried or failed to try, how long the hospitals kept the lights on before they didn't. He wakes up in the ruins and starts moving forward, and the audience following him does the same. Here's what I find quietly unsettling about that. The walkers are almost beside the point in the early seasons. The real question the show keeps circling is about human systems, governments, communities, trust, leadership. The walkers are constant background noise, but the drama is always about what people do in response to them. And what people did before Rick woke up, before Season 1, before the story as we know it began, is something the franchise has been quietly, methodically exploring across spin-offs ever since. Fear the Walking Dead, which debuted in 2015, gave us the closest thing to a ground-level account of the collapse. We see Travis, Manawa, and Madison Clark navigating the early days in Los Angeles. The first rumours, the first weird incidents, the terrifying realisation that something is very wrong. And what Fear shows us, consistently and deliberately, is that the institutions, hospitals, schools, the military, local government, do not hold. Not because they were overwhelmed by force, but because the information they were working from was already incomplete, already late, already wrong. And that closed door in the hospital corridor, the one someone barricaded from the inside, the one that held just long enough for Rick to be sealed away from the worst of it. Feels less like protection in retrospect. It feels like a symbol of everything the old world did in those final days. Close the door, buy some time, hope the problem solves itself. Whatever caused the outbreak, the conditions that let it become a world ender were already in place. And the show, I think, knew that from the very first episode. It just wanted us to feel it before it told us. Dr. Edwin Jenner is one of the most important characters in The Walking Dead, and he barely appears. He shows up in Season 1's finale. TS-19 presides over a single night of warmth and horror, and then chooses to stay behind when everything explodes. He's there for one episode, and yet the information he carries, and chooses to share and chooses to withhold, shapes everything that follows. Let me tell you what Jenner has when the survivors arrive at the CDC. He has a building running on emergency generators, a rapidly depleting power supply, and footage of his wife's death. Test subject, 19. He'd been studying her brain, her infection, the moment reanimation began, because she had asked him to. She wanted her death to mean something, and so Jenner watched his wife die on a monitor, over and over, trying to understand something that couldn't be understood with the resources he had left. The CDC by this point is essentially empty. There were dozens of scientists and support staff when the outbreak began. By the time Rick's group arrives, it's just Jenner. The others either fled or, as Jenner quietly tells us, chose another door entirely. Some took their own lives. The people who were supposed to understand what was happening, who were equipped and trained and funded to find answers, had already decided there were none to be found. Here's what that signals, and it's something I think about every time I revisit this episode. The scientific response to the outbreak didn't fail because the walkers were too many. It failed because the institutional will to keep going collapsed. The CDC wasn't overwhelmed by force. It was abandoned from within. That's a different kind of failure and a more frightening one, because it means the problem wasn't capacity. It was hope. Jenner does tell Rick something before the building goes. He whispers it, and we're not allowed to hear it in Season 1. But later Rick reveals to Laurie what Jenner said, that everyone is already infected. That when you die, you turn, regardless of how you go. The infection isn't transmitted by a bite alone. It's already in everyone. It was already in all of us. What does that change? Everything and nothing. Practically, it means no one is ever truly safe, because survival isn't about avoiding infection. It's about avoiding death. But theoretically, it raises a question the show has never fully answered. If everyone is already carrying the infection, then the outbreak isn't something that was introduced from outside. It's something that was always present, something dormant, waiting for its moment. The closed door of the CDC vault, the one that seals with mechanical certainty, the one that marks the end of the old world's last official attempt to understand itself, isn't just a dramatic image. It's a boundary. On one side, the world that had answers, or at least the infrastructure to look for them. On the other, the world Rick and his people have to survive in, permanently without context. And Jenner, standing in front of that door, made a choice. He chose to stay. He chose to let the door seal, but he also chose to tell Rick the most important thing he knew. The thing no government press release, no emergency broadcast, no CDC bulletin had communicated to the general public before the collapse. Was that a kindness? Was it a burden? I genuinely don't know. And I think that ambiguity is intentional. What I keep circling back to is the footage of TS-19, Jenner's wife, the brain lighting up, then going dark, then slowly beginning again in a diminished, ravenous form. She let him study her because she believed knowledge mattered. She believed that even at the worst possible moment, someone should be watching and recording and trying to understand. The CDC sealed that door on all of that. The accumulated knowledge, the sacrifice of one woman who chose to mean something in her dying, gone in the explosion. Whatever she learned, whatever Jenna discovered, stayed in that building. That door didn't just close on a building. It closed on the world's last official attempt to understand itself. And what I find most quietly devastating about Jenna is that he knew. He knew the door was closing. And he let it. Here's the thing about Rick Grimes that doesn't always get talked about. He is an extraordinarily effective leader, operating on almost no correct information. From the very beginning, Rick is behind. He missed the collapse. He had no framework for understanding walkers, or outbreaks, or the new rules of this world. He had to be told, by Morgan, by Jenna, by the people he moved through. And then he had to move immediately, because there was never time for anything else. This is the condition from which Rick Grimes leads for the next 9 seasons, perpetually catching up, perpetually making decisions on incomplete pictures, perpetually discovering that the world is worse than he understood. Think about the pattern. In season 2, Rick doesn't know there are walkers in Herschel's barn until the moment he does. In season 3, he doesn't fully grasp what the governor is capable of until it's too late to stop the assault on the prison. In season 4, the disease spreading through the prison has a human source he doesn't know about. In season 5, he doesn't know what Terminus is until he's inside it. In season 6, Negan exists as a structural threat for months before Rick understands the shape of it. And by the time he does, Abraham and Glenn are gone. Over and over and over, the story positions Rick as a man who discovers danger after it has already taken root. This isn't a writing failure. I think it's a thesis statement. The show is arguing consistently across seasons that the conditions which doom any group, including Rick's, are already in place before anyone becomes aware of them. The threat is never fully external. It emerges from gaps in knowledge, from failures of communication, from choices made under pressure without all the facts. Rick's leadership is powerful and real, and genuinely inspiring, but it is always reactive. He is always already late. And what makes this interesting in the context of this theory is that Rick's position mirrors the world's position before the outbreak. Governments, institutions, the CDC, they were all catching up too. Fear the Walking Dead makes this viscerally clear. By the time Travis or Madison understood what was happening in Los Angeles, the military was already making choices that couldn't be walked back. Quarantine zones were being drawn around communities of the living. The system was already responding to a problem it hadn't fully defined. Rick carries a badge, the sheriff's star, long after there's no law left to enforce. He carries his Colt Python, even when ammunition is scarce, because it connects him to a continuity he refuses to let go of. He carries throughout the entire series the belief that people can rebuild, that community is possible, that the old world's values, law, protection, fairness, are worth preserving in the new one. And that belief is both his greatest strength and the source of every major tragedy in his arc. Because he's fighting for a world that by the time he woke up in that hospital had already effectively ended. He's not rebuilding something that fell, he's trying to build something that may never have fully existed in the first place. In season 9, when Rick makes the decision to blow the bridge, to sacrifice himself to save his people and destroy a walker herd, it's framed as the ultimate act of hope, a leader choosing to give up his future so others have theirs. And then he survives, taken away by a CRM helicopter, sealed into a new institutional system in an instant. One door closes, another opens. And this time Rick doesn't get to choose. There's a quiet echo there worth noticing. In season 1, a door closes on the old world and Rick walks into the unknown. In season 9, a door closes on Rick's free life and something else begins. He's been on the outside of closed doors for his entire arc. And now we learn he's been on the inside of one. The hospital corridor where he woke up, the barricaded door, that protected only his unconscious body while everything else was already gone. That image, the closed door as the shape of protection that doesn't quite work, follows Rick Grimes like a shadow. And what's on the other side of his latest door? That's where things start to get really interesting. One of the things Fear the Walking Dead did exceptionally well in its first season was show us how fast everything falls. Not dramatically fast, not in the Hollywood disaster movie sense, where buildings crumble and sirens wail, and we immediately understand civilization is over. It falls in the in-between moments, in the space between one news report and the next, in the awkward silence when someone says, "I'm sure they have it under control," and nobody in the room quite believes them. Fear's first season is set in Los Angeles, and it follows the Clark Manawa family, Madison, Travis, Nick, Alicia, through the very early days of what the world would eventually call the outbreak. What strikes me most when I revisit that first season isn't the walkers, it's the infrastructure. Power flickers, cell service becomes unreliable, supply chains stutter. The military arrives in the neighbourhood and sets up a safe zone, which sounds like a solution until you realise the people running it don't have better information than anyone else. They have guns, they have orders, they do not have answers. Here's the detail from Fear Season 1 that I can't stop thinking about. The military doesn't fail because they're overrun. They fail because the situation they're responding to has already moved past the point where a conventional response could work. By the time boots are on the ground in Los Angeles, the infection isn't something that can be quarantined. It's already inside the perimeter, it's been there for a while. The safe zone fence, in that sense, is just a closed door, drawn very large. And this is where the pattern becomes worth paying attention to. Because Fear isn't the only place in the franchise where we see this. In the original series, we're told in scattered survivor accounts that the military set up similar operations across the United States. Refugee camps, quarantine zones, National Guard deployments, all of it collapsed. Not because of lack of firepower in the immediate sense, but because the operational assumption was wrong from the start. They were treating a global reanimation event like a local outbreak, a containable thing, a problem with a perimeter. The power grid failing's the detail that haunts me most. Power doesn't fail in days during a normal crisis. Infrastructure is designed with redundancies. It takes sustained damage or catastrophic central failures to bring down a grid that quickly. When Season 1 opens, electricity is already sparse in most areas Rick moves through. By Season 2, it's largely gone. The timeline implied is measured in weeks, not months. For a viral outbreak, even an extremely fast-moving one, that's a strikingly short window. Viruses don't shut off power stations. They don't close bridges. Those things happen when the people responsible for maintaining them are no longer there, or no longer able to do the work, or have made the decision that their own survival outweighs their operational duty. The infrastructure didn't fail because walkers destroyed it. It failed because humans abandoned it, because the people who were supposed to keep the lights on made a judgment call, consciously or in panic, that the lights weren't worth keeping on anymore. And that judgment call was made before most ordinary people even knew something was wrong. I think about Travis Manawa standing in the street in early Season 1, watching something unfold that doesn't fit any framework he has. He's confused, he's scared, he's trying to understand, and just out of frame, the system is already deciding that this situation is unsalvageable. The closed door, here, is the chain link fence of the safe zone. It keeps the wrong things out and the right things in, until it doesn't. And the people inside realise the zone was never really safe. It was just a line someone drew in panic. The Walking Dead universe keeps returning to this image. A fence, a wall, a door. Something that promises containment and delivers, at best, delay. The prison walls Alexandria's barrier, the Commonwealth's fortifications. Each one eventually fails, not because it was weak, but because the threat it was designed to contain was never only external. The pattern of the fence failing before the people inside expected it to. That pattern is going to matter a lot when we look at who was building something that didn't fail at all. Let's talk about the CRM. The Civic Republic Military is the largest remaining organised military force in the Walking Dead universe, operating in secret, maintaining a civilian population of around 200,000 people. We first see their helicopters in the background of Season 7, glimpsed, unexplained, easy to miss. And by Season 9 they're taking Rick Grimes away in one. They become central in The Walking Dead, World Beyond, where we learn their methods, their resources, and their controlling philosophy. And they're the backdrop of The Ones Who Live, where Rick's years inside their system finally get a story. The CRM's defining characteristic, beyond their military efficiency, is secrecy. They don't announce themselves. They don't invite negotiation. They evaluate communities, form alliances that function more like leverage, and operate from a position of consistent informational advantage. They know more than everyone else. They use that knowledge deliberately. Here's where it starts getting genuinely interesting. In The Walking Dead World Beyond, specifically in the Season 2 finale, there is a brief post-credits scene set in France. A scientist is working in what appears to be a functional research lab when something goes wrong. Another figure attacks her. The imagery, the setting, the context all point towards something significant. France was further ahead in researching the infection than the rest of the world. The implication, and I want to be clear, this is where I'm moving into theory territory, is that the outbreak may have had origins, or at least early development connected to scientific research, that predated the events of Season 1. What the scene doesn't tell us is exactly what the French scientists knew, when they knew it, or what connection any of it has to the CRM. But the franchise placed that scene deliberately, at the end of a season full of CRM revelations, as a final punctuation mark. It's an invitation to ask the question. And the question I keep returning to is this: if the CRM survived the collapse so completely, with organised infrastructure, a military hierarchy, a functioning civilian population, when did they start organising? How much lead time did they have? Because building what the CRM has built takes years. It takes coordination before the crisis, not improvised response during it. The Civic Republic doesn't look like a refugee camp that grew. It looks like a structured society that operated continuously through the worst years of the apocalypse, with minimal visible disruption to its command structure. That implies planning. That implies someone, somewhere, had contingency systems in place for a catastrophic civilizational collapse. And possibly knew one was coming. I want to be careful here because this is the space where theory outpaces what the show has confirmed. The CRM's founding story hasn't been fully told. We don't know exactly who built it, when, or on what foreknowledge. What The Ones Who Live shows us is a CRM that is internally fractured. Not all of its members believe in what they're doing, but still operating according to a philosophy that treats population as a resource, transparency as a threat, and survival as a math problem. That philosophy doesn't emerge overnight. Institutions develop worldviews slowly through arguments and calculated choices. The CRM thinks the way it thinks because someone at its founding decided that survival required secrecy, that community required control, and that the future had to be managed rather than allowed. Iris and Hope Bennett in World Beyond are the characters who crack this open most directly. They're raised within the orbit of the CRM's influence, and then they discover that everything they were told about the collapse, about their father's research, about the world, was filtered through the CRM's version of events. The story they've been given wasn't exactly false, it just had closed doors inside it, rooms they were never allowed to enter. The closed door here is institutional. It's the CRM's deliberate management of what people are allowed to know about the world they're surviving in, about what caused all of this, about who might have seen it coming. And that kind of door, it doesn't close by accident. Someone decides to close it, and someone decides they'd like to be the only one with a key. There's a moment in season 11 of The Walking Dead that tends to get lost in the noise of the Commonwealth Arc. A walker opens a door, not in a stumbling, random way, not because it happened to fall against a handle. It grips the door, turns it, and pushes through. It's fast, it's deliberate, and it's terrifying not because of what it does next, but because of what it means about what walkers might be becoming. Season 11 introduces what survivors begin to call variants. Walkers that exhibit behaviours beyond the standard shambling aggression. They climb. They work around obstacles. They appear in some rudimentary way to retain traces of how certain things work. This matters enormously to the theory we've been building, and here's why. If walkers can develop new behaviours, then the outbreak itself is not a fixed event with fixed parameters. It is a process, a slow, evolving one. And if that's true, then the question of whether the world was doomed from day one becomes much more complicated and much more interesting. Here's what I keep noticing. The variant walkers in season 11 don't appear out of nowhere. They appear precisely when Alexandria's survivors are beginning to integrate into the Commonwealth, beginning to believe that stability might be possible, beginning to lower their guard in ways they haven't in years. The show's pattern, across 11 seasons, is remarkably consistent. The moment a community feels genuinely safe, something new emerges to challenge the terms of that safety. In France, in Daryl Dixon's first season, the variant behaviour becomes even more pronounced. Daryl encounters walkers that operate with something resembling strategic awareness, and the types of behaviour on display represent some of the most unsettling developments in the franchise's walker mythology. France, remember, is also where that post-credits lab scene from World Beyond was set. The research, the implication that scientists there knew something the rest of the world didn't. Is the variant behaviour connected to French research? To the CRM's scientific programmes, which we know from World Beyond are focused on understanding the infection? The show hasn't confirmed it, but the proximity of these revelations, France variants, the CRM's documented obsession with biological research, doesn't feel accidental. What I find most emotionally resonant about the variants is what they say about the cost of adaptation. Every time survivors get better at surviving, every time they build walls and establish routines and start sleeping through the night, the world around them quietly adjusts. It's not personal, it's not malicious, but it functions as a kind of narrative law. The apocalypse earns what the survivors invest. If you become better at defense, the threat finds new angles. If you build a community, something will test whether it deserves to last. Carol understood this instinctively, even if she never articulated it that neatly. When she's teaching children to use weapons in season 4, or when she's walking into Terminus alone with a coat full of guns, she's operating from a premise most of Rick's group struggled to accept. Safety is always temporary, and the cost of forgetting that is usually someone you love. The closed door in this chapter is biological. The variant walkers represent a kind of cellular memory, something in the infection finding new expression as conditions change. The door that was closed on what this infection can do keeps opening, just slightly, every few seasons. And each time it does, what's on the other side is a little further than anyone expected. There's something worth holding on to here about Laurent in Daryl Dixon's first season. The young boy who may represent something genuinely new, possibly the key to something the CRM has been building toward. The show hasn't confirmed his exact significance, but his existence in France, near variant behaviour and historical research, suggests that the variant question and the cure question and the origin question may all be the same question, wearing different faces. Whatever the answer is, it's behind a door the franchise has been slowly, carefully approaching since the very beginning. And every time a walker opens another door, it shouldn't be able to open. Every time the world adapts back. The original question gets more urgent. The Walking Dead universe has a recurring character type that I find more compelling than any of its heroes or villains. The person who knows something they shouldn't. Jenner is the most obvious example. He had the TS19 research, the knowledge that everyone was already infected, and the understanding that the scientific response had effectively run out of road. He chose to share the infection truth with Rick privately rather than announce it. He chose to let the building explode rather than keep trying. His knowledge didn't save anyone in the group. It burdened one man with a secret he had to decide when and how to share. And then there's Eugene Porter. Eugene arrived in season 4 with Abraham Ford and Rosita Espinosa, making a remarkable claim. He was a scientist who knew what caused the outbreak and had the means to address it. He used that claim to get protection, to get people moving toward Washington, D.C., to give survivors a purpose at a time when purpose was the only thing keeping some of them alive. The claim was false. Eugene isn't a scientist in the relevant field. He made the whole thing up. But here's what makes Eugene one of the most quietly fascinating figures in the franchise. He's not actually incompetent, and he's not entirely wrong about science. He has genuine technical knowledge. He figures out how to manufacture ammunition. He understands complex systems and applies that understanding practically. His lie was about his credentials and specific mission, not about his fundamental capability. So why lie about a cure? I think the most honest reading's that Eugene understood instinctively what the group needed. Not just food and safety and defence, but a direction, a story about the future. He manufactured that story because he grasped something that leadership theorists would recognise. People survive longer when they believe survival has a purpose. His lie was, in a terrible and uncomfortable way, functionally kind, and it worked, until it didn't. What Eugene actually represented in those middle seasons was the possibility of institutional knowledge. Someone who understood how the old world functioned, who could reach back into it and extract something useful for the new one. And the Commonwealth, when it appears in season 11, is the franchise's fullest expression of that possibility taken to its logical endpoint. The Commonwealth kept records. It maintained old world professional structures. It had an archive of what the world was like before. Governor Pamela Milton controlled that archive. And like every closed door in this franchise, the archive wasn't open to everyone. The information about who got what, who mattered, who had access to safety and resources. It was managed, filtered, turned into a tool. The Commonwealth's great failure, as the show frames it, isn't that it couldn't rebuild. It's that it rebuilt the old world's hierarchies first and its values second. The knowledge of how things worked became a closed door that only certain people were allowed to walk through. And this is the pattern I keep seeing across every iteration of the franchise. Every time someone has more information than everyone else, that information becomes a form of power. Jenner used it to maintain sovereignty over his last days. Eugene used it to manufacture safety. The CRM uses it to maintain geopolitical dominance over every surviving community they encounter. Pamela Milton used it to preserve the class structure she grew up inside. The closed door here is epistemic. The gap between what is known and what is shared. And every major institutional failure in the Walking Dead universe can be mapped onto that gap. The CDC, the military quarantine zones, the Saviour's resource system, the Commonwealth. In each case, The people with information decided that sharing it was more dangerous than hoarding it. And in each case, the people excluded from that information paid for the decision with their lives. Rick was always on the outside of these doors. He found out about the infection from Jenna. He learned about the CRM through painful personal experience, not disclosure. He discovered most of the threats he faced after they'd already been operating for a while. That's not bad luck. In the Walking Dead universe, that's the standard condition for anyone who isn't already inside the system. And that condition, I quietly believe, was in place long before the first Walker stood up. I want to step back from individual stories for a moment and look at the franchise as a whole. Because there's a structural pattern here that I think is one of the most underappreciated things about the Walking Dead universe as a piece of sustained storytelling. Every major community in the franchise follows the same arc. A group finds or builds a space. They establish rules. Internal tensions develop around leadership, resources, and who belongs and who doesn't. An external threat emerges. They survive it or they don't. And if they survive, the next threat usually comes from within. From the compromises made during the first crisis, from the rules that were bent to endure, from the people who gained power in the chaos and have no intention of returning it. The prison, Woodbury, the sanctuary, Alexandria, the hilltop, the kingdom, Oceanside, the Commonwealth, Manhattan in Dead City, the settlements of France in Daryl Dixon. Each of them follows this arc. None of them is immune. Even the most thoughtfully constructed of these communities, the one that came closest to something like a working society, eventually fractured under the pressure of its own internal contradictions. This isn't random. The showrunners have been remarkably consistent about it, carrying forward what Robert Kirkman established in the comics. The apocalypse doesn't end communities. Communities end communities. Here's what that pattern says about the theory we've been building. If every attempt to reconstruct civilized life repeats the same failure modes, hierarchy, information control, the exclusion of those who don't fit the existing power structure, then the apocalypse didn't introduce those failure modes. It stripped away the mechanisms that previously managed and obscured them. The old world wasn't better at solving these problems. It was better at hiding them behind prosperity and procedure and the comfortable assumption that things were basically working. And here's what makes that frightening. It means there was no version of the old world that was especially well positioned to survive what happened. The societies that fell weren't falling because they lacked resilience. They were already fragile in ways they couldn't see or wouldn't acknowledge, because acknowledging fragility in a functioning society is politically and socially costly. You don't get to say the system is broken when the system is the thing protecting you. This is, I think, the deepest reason the franchise never explains the outbreak's origin, because the origin doesn't matter as much as the conditions. A pandemic, an ecological collapse, a war, a slow economic failure. Any of these could have triggered the same cascade. The walkers are the specific form the catastrophe took. But the catastrophe itself was always going to happen to a world organised the way this one was. Fear the Walking Dead showed us one city's collapse. The original show followed survivors through years of aftermath. World Beyond showed us the geopolitical shape of what remained. Daryl Dixon is revealing that the failure happened globally, that France's version looks different from America's, but follows recognisable logic. Dead City is showing us what a specific, extreme geography does to community building, how Manhattan, already physically isolated, became a closed system so total that its internal society evolved into something almost unrecognisable. The closed door appears in every one of these stories. In Fear, it's the safe zone fence. In World Beyond, it's the CRM's information hierarchy. In the original series, it's every gate and wall that turned out to be less solid than it looked. In Dead City, It's the burrow itself, the island that sealed itself in. In Daryl Dixon, it's the literal and metaphorical borders of France, carrying its own version of a history the rest of the world doesn't know. The door keeps appearing. It keeps failing. And each time it does, the question isn't only why this particular door failed, it's why we keep building them. Maybe because we have to. Maybe because boundaries, walls, fences, systems of in and out, belonging and exclusion are the only tools communities have ever known. The apocalypse didn't give us that tendency. We brought it with us from the world before. And if we brought it with us, then the doom wasn't something that arrived from outside. It travelled with the survivors every step of the way. That's a quiet thought. But the franchise doesn't leave it there. And that's where the next part of this gets complicated, in the most unexpectedly hopeful way. So here's the theory, stated as cleanly as I can manage. The Walking Dead universe is not telling a story about a society that was destroyed by a catastrophe. It's telling a story about a society that was already failing, and how a catastrophe made that failure impossible to ignore any longer. The outbreak didn't doom the world. The world was already the kind of place that, under sufficient stress, would doom itself. The walkers are the stress. The doom was already in the architecture. Let me walk through the logic because I think it holds together. By the time Rick woke up, the collapse was already weeks old and already comprehensive. Infrastructure gone, military overwhelmed, scientific response effectively abandoned. That isn't a pandemic timeline. That's a fracture timeline. Things that were already cracked giving way all at once when the pressure finally came. The institutions that should have managed the crisis didn't fail because of pure incompetence or uniquely bad luck. They failed because they were operating on incomplete information, making decisions based on frameworks designed for a different world, and, critically, prioritizing the protection of their own power structures over the needs of the people they were supposed to serve. That's not a feature of zombie apocalypses. That's a feature of late-stage institutional failure in any civilization under extreme stress. Every community built in the aftermath replicates these failure modes. Not because survivors are bad people, most of them are trying genuinely hard, but because the blueprints they know are the blueprints from the old world. They build walls because walls are what communities build. They appoint leaders because that's how groups organise. They control information because information is power, and power protects the people who hold it. The apocalypse gave them new material conditions. It didn't give them new social tools. The CRM, the most powerful surviving institutional force, appears to have been organised before or during the earlier stages of collapse, with coordination suggesting either prescience or foreknowledge. Whether they saw the collapse coming, moved faster than everyone else in the critical early weeks, or had contingency plans already in place, we don't know for certain. But their existence, their structure, their philosophy, all of it points toward an institution that treated civilizational collapse, not as an unthinkable emergency, but as a scenario worth planning for. If the show follows the pattern it's been building, and in my view it has been remarkably consistent, then the story of the CRM's founding, when it fully comes, will show an organisation that understood the world was fragile long before the fragility became public knowledge. Not necessarily an organisation that caused the collapse, but one positioned to survive it, to inherit it. And that inheritance is the most uncomfortable part of the theory. Because if you build an institution specifically designed to survive civilizational collapse, if you make decisions during the chaos that consolidate your position, eliminate competition, and establish information control as a foundational principle, then you're not rebuilding civilization. You're building a successor civilization in the image of what you valued most about the old one. And what the CRM seems to have valued most is hierarchy, secrecy, and the efficient management of population as a resource. Negan articulated this worldview at its most direct in various speeches to the Saviours, describing people as a resource, the foundation of what was being built. The framing sounds monstrous in isolation, but it's worth noticing that the CRM, operating at vastly larger scale, uses the exact same framework. 200,000 people, maintained and managed because a functioning civilian population is the most valuable asset a surviving military organisation can possess. That's not an apocalypse value system. That's an old world value system, carried forward through the closed door, refined maybe, organised more efficiently, but recognisably continuous with what the old world's most powerful institutions always believed. If that's what survived, then what survived isn't recovery from the world's failure. It's a refinement of it. The vault door at the CDC didn't just close on one building's worth of knowledge. It opened onto a future that was, from its first moments, being shaped by the same instincts that shaped the world that fell. Let's think about who actually benefits from the way things ended up. Not from the walkers, not from the death count and the devastation, but from the specific shape of the post-outbreak world, the particular distribution of power, the particular organisations that emerged from the chaos with their structures intact, the particular communities that survived while others collapsed. The answer, when you look at it clearly, is the people who were already organised. The Saviours under Negan were a structured, hierarchical operation, experienced at extracting resources from others before the apocalypse. When civilization fell, that particular skill set became geopolitically valuable almost immediately. They didn't build something new, they scaled something they already had, and for years, across multiple communities and considerable geography, it worked. The Commonwealth de Conquistador, the franchise's most elaborate surviving society, was built largely by people who had access to resources, records, and social networks from the old world. Governor Pamela Milton's family history, her institutional connections, her understanding of how systems function, all of it transferred directly into the new hierarchy. The class structure that emerged wasn't designed for the apocalypse, it was imported from before it. The lawyers and professionals and well-connected families who arrived early received better housing, better food, better access to safety. People who arrived later, or who didn't fit the expected profile, received different treatment. That isn't a zombie apocalypse dynamic. It's a deeply recognisable human dynamic that became visible because the old world's mechanisms for obscuring it had been stripped away. Maggie Rhee has been fighting this specific pattern for years. In Season 11, her conflict with the Commonwealth isn't simply about defeating Pamela Milton. It's about refusing to let the same structures that produced the old world define the new one. Maggie's entire arc, from the fall of the prison, through Hilltop's founding, through the streets of Dead City, is about trying to build communities that don't replicate the hierarchies she always knew were unjust. She doesn't always succeed. The old structures have enormous gravity. But she keeps trying, and the franchise honours that effort as something genuinely worth the cost. Daryl's arc in France mirrors this in a different register. He arrives in a country with its own version of the collapse, its own surviving power structures, its own iteration of the closed door problem. The controlling forces in Daryl Dixon represent the same instinct the CRM embodies. Use the chaos to consolidate, use consolidation to control, use control to determine who lives and who serves. Daryl characteristically refuses the frame entirely. He doesn't want institutional power. He wants to find his people and go home. And that refusal, that insistence on personal loyalty over institutional allegiance, is the franchise's quietest and most consistent counter-argument to everything the CRM represents. Because here's what the CRM, the Commonwealth, and every other surviving power structure have in common? They survived by treating the apocalypse as an optimization problem. They asked, essentially, how do we preserve the most important parts of the old world? And then they determined what was most important based on what they already valued. The people who had no institutional standing in the old world. The people outside the closed doors, before the outbreak, people whose survival was never included in official contingency planning. Are where the franchise's heroes actually come from. Rick was a county sheriff in rural Georgia. Carol was a domestic abuse survivor. Daryl was someone the old world barely registered. Maggie grew up on a farm. They didn't benefit from the way things collapsed. They survived it anyway. And in surviving it, they built the only communities in the franchise that ever came close to getting something right. Not because those communities were perfect, but because they were built on relationships rather than inherited hierarchies. That distinction matters. And the fact that every relationship-built community in the franchise has been threatened, pressured, or dismantled by a hierarchy-built institution. That's not coincidence. That's the franchise's central argument, restated so many times across so many stories that it begins to feel like a law of this universe. The world was doomed from day one, but the door to something genuinely different, that one was never quite fully closed. And the people we've been watching for 15 years have been quietly, stubbornly refusing to let it shut completely. And then there's Rick. The Ones Who Live changes things. It answers the question the franchise has been carrying since season 9. What happened to Rick Grimes? What happened in broad strokes is this. Jadis, Anne, traded Rick to the CRM in exchange for a higher classification within their system. She used him as a resource, in exactly the way Negan's framework described, and the CRM's philosophy demands. Rick was valuable because he was alive, capable, and trusted by people who mattered. He became a CRM asset, and then for years he couldn't leave. Every attempt to escape put Michonne, put Judith, put Carl's memory, the entire world he was trying to get back to, at risk. He stayed not because he believed in the CRM, but because leaving meant the CRM would find the people he loved. The closed door here is Rick's own deepest quality turned against him. He built his identity around protecting the people he cared about. The CRM used that identity as a cage. What's extraordinary about The Ones Who Live is how it depicts Rick's time inside the machine. He doesn't become the CRM. He doesn't adopt their worldview. But he understands it. He can operate within it. He knows how the system thinks, what it values, where its pressure points are. And by the time Michonne finds him, he is simultaneously more dangerous and more isolated than at any point in his previous arc. There's something worth sitting with in the context of this theory. Rick Grimes spent his entire story trying to protect communities built on relationship and loyalty. And his worst nightmare isn't the Walkers, and it isn't the Governor, or the Saviors, or the Whisperers. His worst nightmare is the CRM. Because the CRM doesn't fight his values with opposing values. It fights them by incorporating him into a system so large and so self-perpetuating that his individual resistance barely registers as friction. This is the franchise's deepest and most unsettling idea. The thing that truly threatened to undo Rick wasn't violence or cruelty, it was bureaucracy, institution. The closed door of the CRM, which isn't a door you break down. It's a door you're inside, and the air is fine, and you can almost convince yourself the room is the whole world. Michonne's line in The Ones Who Live, "We're the ones who live," is spoken in that context. It isn't triumphant exactly. It's honest. It's the recognition that survival at this scale and cost isn't the same as thriving. They're the ones who live, not the ones who fixed anything, not the ones who got it right. the ones who are still standing, still together, still choosing each other over the system that tried to define them. The closed door motif transforms completely here. In Season 1, the CDC vault sealed shut and Rick walked away from it, into the unknown. In Season 9, a helicopter door closed behind him, and he was gone. In The Ones Who Live, Rick is on the inside of the mechanism for the first time. He knows where the door is. He knows why it's closed. He knows who decided to close it. And the question, which the show leaves deliberately open, is what Rick does with that knowledge now. Does he try to dismantle it from within? Does he use his position to change the system? Does he walk away and try to live quietly with Michonne and Judith, letting someone else worry about what the CRM eventually becomes? These feel like personal questions, but the franchise has spent 15 years showing us that Rick's personal choices are never only personal. What he decides ripples outward. His hope, his stubbornness about what people are worth, his refusal to let the math of survival override the weight of individual lives. It has always been the series' argument against the doom we've been tracing. So the question of whether Rick is still fighting for people, or whether he's gradually become part of what doomed them, isn't settled. It's open. And that openness, that refusal to grant Rick a clean moral status at this stage of his story, is exactly what makes his continuing arc so rich with possibility. He knows where all the closed doors are now. And knowledge in this universe is always both a gift and a weight. Here's the part that makes this theory worth spending time with. Instead of leaving us somewhere quiet and bleak, about systems and doom and sealed rooms, the Walking Dead universe has always had children, not as symbols or narrative afterthoughts, as arguments. Judith Grimes, Gracie, Herschel Reed Jr., Henry, Lydia. The young people who grew up in the Commonwealth schools, Laurent somewhere in France. Every child in this franchise is, narratively speaking, the franchise's rebuttal to its own thesis. Because if the world was doomed from day one, if the conditions that produced the apocalypse were baked into the civilization that preceded it, then the children who grew up after those conditions no longer apply, are genuinely different people. They don't carry the old world's blueprints. They don't inherit its assumptions. They grew up knowing a different version of what human community can look like, because the communities that raised them were built on survival loyalty rather than class or institution or access to controlled information. Judith Grimes is the clearest expression of this. She was born at the prison, into chaos and immediate loss, and she grew up in Alexandria with a sword in her hand and her father's sheriff's hat on her head, and a mind that is, by every account the show gives us, sharper and more ethically rigorous than almost anyone around her. She didn't inherit Rick's world, she inherited his values, refracted through Michonne's, through Carl's, through everyone who raised her. And she's making something with them that the old world never quite managed to articulate. Carl's letter, which Rick reads after his son's death in Season 9, is the franchise's most direct statement of this. Carl wrote it to his father about what the future could look like. Not a restoration of what came before, but something genuinely different. A world where Negan could be part of a community if he chose it. A world where the cycle of violence and retaliation could be broken by one person deciding to stop perpetuating it. Carl's letter is, at its heart, an argument against inherited doom, against the premise that the sins of the old world must be carried forward into the new one. Rick spared Negan partly because of that letter. And Negan, who began the series as a precise embodiment of old world power logic scaled to apocalypse conditions, became, over years of confinement and reflection, and eventually genuine contribution, something harder to place in a simple category. By Dead City, Negan is in the ruins of Manhattan protecting Maggie's son, Herschel Jr., not out of institutional loyalty, not out of hierarchy or strategic calculation, out of something more complicated, and the show suggests more real. That transformation is the franchise's most sustained argument against doom thinking. Negan didn't change because the system changed him. He changed because people kept choosing to engage with him as a person rather than as a category. Judith, Carol, Maggie, painfully, partially, with full acknowledgement of everything he took from her. The choice to keep the door open, not to trust blindly, not to forgive without cost, but to keep engaging rather than closing off. That's the counter-thesis to everything the CRM represents. The CRM's philosophy treats people as resources. The franchise's emotional argument, delivered through Carl's letter, through Judith's choices, through Negan's arc, through every found family that formed in the ruins of the old world, is that people are not resources, they are reasons. And that distinction, quietly, across 15 seasons and multiple spin-offs, is what the franchise has been trying to say about Doom all along. Yes, the conditions were in place. Yes, the world had the failure modes that produced this catastrophe baked into it. Yes, the institutions that survived replicated those failure modes. Yes, the closed doors kept closing. But also, Judith exists. Herschel Jr. exists. Laurent in France possibly exists as something genuinely new in this world's biology and hope alike. The children of this story don't carry the closed doors inside them the way the adults do. They grew up in the cracks between the old systems, in the spaces where the doors hadn't been fully built yet. That doesn't resolve anything. It doesn't fix the CRM or the variant walkers, or the weight of everything that was lost. But it changes what Doom means. Doom isn't destiny, it's context, and context, it turns out, can be survived. So let's go back to where we started. Season 1, Episode 6, The CDC. Dr. Jenna standing in front of the door. I've been thinking about that scene differently now, after everything this theory has walked through. And I want to share where I keep landing. When the survivors arrive at the CDC, they're desperate. They haven't had a shower in months. Shane is fraying at the edges. Andrea is barely holding on after losing Amy. Carol is still learning what freedom from fear feels like when it's not immediately replaced by something else. Laurie is trying to hold her family together through exhaustion and grief and uncertainty. She doesn't have words for. Rick is carrying the weight of leading people through something he fundamentally doesn't understand, toward a destination he can't see. And for one night inside that building with its humming generators and its warm water and its wine and its strange, impossible quiet, they get to breathe. They get to feel, briefly, that there might still be places in the world where some version of ordinary holds, where the old comforts exist, where the future isn't only the next hour. Jenna gives them that night deliberately. He knows the building's set to destroy itself. He could announce it immediately. He doesn't. He lets them have the dinner and the shower and the sleep and the temporary feeling of being somewhere that still works. Because he understands, with whatever is left of his scientific detachment and his private grief, that people need moments of warmth before they can face what comes next. That's the detail I keep returning to. Not the explosion, not the whisper. The dinner. Jenna's last act isn't a revelation or a detonation. It's a kindness. And the closed door of the CDC vault, the image we've been carrying through this entire theory, isn't only about institutional failure or information control or the sealed away knowledge of what caused all of this. It's also about that dinner, about the brief possibility of warmth in a place that was already doomed, about the choice to give people something before everything was taken. The door is a threshold. That's what it has always been. Everything we've traced through this theory lives on one side or the other of doors that opened and closed throughout this story. The collapse before Rick woke up. the CDC's abandonment of its own mission, the infrastructure failure that happened faster than it should have, the CRM's rise, the variant walkers, the survivors who knew too much and used that knowledge in different ways, the communities that replicated old failures, the children who didn't have to. All of it lives near a door, and the door at the end of the CDC wasn't only an ending. The show told us that immediately, in the very next episode, when the survivors drove away from the explosion and kept moving, the door closed. They didn't. Judith is still out there. Daryl is still walking across France with a crossbow and a stubbornness that has outlasted every institution the franchise has built and then watched fall. Maggie is still trying to build something that doesn't repeat what came before. Rick and Michonne are somewhere together, figuring out what the next chapter of their lives looks like, and what, if anything, they owe to the system they now understand from the inside. The franchise hasn't resolved any of this cleanly. It hasn't told us definitively who built the CRM and when, or whether variant walkers represent something that can be countered or something that simply has to be lived with, or what Laurent's existence ultimately means, or what Rick's knowledge of the machine will be used to do. The doors are still partly open. The questions are still alive. But it has told us consistently and with genuine emotional conviction that the doom and the hope have always coexisted in the same moment. That the world was fragile and failing and already falling in ways it couldn't see. And that in that same world, people were capable of extraordinary loyalty, tenderness, and refusal to stop believing in each other. Maybe the world was always going to fall. The conditions were there, the cracks were there. The closed doors and the ones that sealed in knowledge, sealed out people, sealed away the possibility of genuine accountability. They were there long before the first walker ever stood up. But in the spaces between those doors, in the cracks where the light came through, that's where Judith learned to use a sword. That's where Carl wrote his letter. That's where Daryl kept walking, and Maggie kept building, and Rick kept choosing people over systems, even when the systems won. The CDC door sealed shut. The building went up in fire, and somewhere just down the road, a door was left slightly open. I think it still is.